Hello, everyone. We will wait just a few seconds for everybody to come into the Zoom room, and then we will get started. If you just come in, we will wait a few seconds for others to join, and then we will get started. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We have gathered on a significant day with voting and the election finished, but counting of votes definitely not finished. Elections for the US president have important consequences for people living in the United States, of course, but also because of the US role in the world for many people living outside the United States. This year's election is especially important given the stark differences between the two candidates. As I wrote to the Harvard Kennedy School community last week, I would be disappointed if people here did not care deeply about the outcome of the election. Caring deeply means that many of us are having and will continue to have strong reactions of happiness, fear, sadness, excitement, and more. Reactions will be different across members of our community and may be particularly intense for those who feel most affected personally by the policies and practices of the different leaders. Moreover, we all understand these stressors are coming on top of a terrible pandemic, struggles over racism, a sharp economic downturn, and many other problems and sources of uncertainty. So I want to begin by repeating my exhortation from last week and urge you to be compassionate with yourselves and with others today and in the days ahead. The social norms that we have discussed recently in some groups at the Kennedy School emphasize the importance of empathy, respect, and flexibility, especially during difficult times. Please keep that in mind. And if you would benefit from any sort of personal support or know someone who would, please reach out to one of the many resources available to you that I summarized in my message last week. I also urge you to focus on the values that bind us together as a community and help us serve the societies that we belong to. Last Friday, the deans of all of Harvard schools, together with the president and provost, sent a message reaffirming those values. We wrote that we are committed to a just Harvard and a just world where all people's rights and dignity are respected and honored. We wrote that we are committed to free and honest inquiry in the unfettered pursuit of truth, which requires reasoned dialogue and a respect for knowledge, evidence, and expertise. And we wrote that we are committed to practices and institutions that enhance the common good, including a successful democracy in the United States with a right to vote and a peaceful transfer of power based on the rule of law. I hope and trust that you share these commitments. Further, I urge you to remember how much important work we at the Kennedy School need to do in this country and around the world in the months and years ahead. Whatever the ultimate results of this election, we need to continue our crucial research, outreach, and teaching and learning. We will conduct research and outreach focused on the most important public challenges of our time. We will teach and learn about principled and effective public policy and leadership. We will also endeavor to understand this election better. As I wrote last week, elections highlight differences in people's views of how the world is and how the world should be. Most predictions of how people would vote in this election, essentially estimates of how people see the world and what they want the world to be, were not accurate. We need to understand voter behavior better, not because we want to produce better polls, but because understanding voters is essential for successful governance. I said in a speech a few weeks ago that we live in a time of great peril and great promise in the public sphere. The peril is probably clear and the litany of public problems we face, but I think the promise is evident as well. Recent events in this country and elsewhere have given many people a renewed understanding of how much we need principled and effective public leaders and public policy. This renewed understanding offers all of us who care about others an important opportunity to build a better future. I ended that speech by saying that the Kennedy School will rise to this occasion, and so we must. As one small step into the future, we've gathered now for a US election debrief. We arranged for this debrief today, even though we knew that the outcome of the election might not be settled, because we thought that people would want to hear about the election and would want to hear about it from some of our faculty experts. For those who are looking for a new website to reload obsessively, Professor Richard Hauser recommended to me this morning the website Odds Shark, which purports to capture betting odds. I have no idea if there's any signal content in that at all, but I know there is signal content, things to learn from our panel of faculty experts who are here. We're very fortunate to have 6 such incredibly knowledgeable and dedicated students and practitioners of US democracy with us. Let me introduce them very briefly. Arthur Brooks is the professor of the practice of public leadership. He joined us just a few years ago after a very successful 10-year stint leading the American Enterprise Institute. Cornell William Brooks is a professor of the practice of public leadership and social justice who came to the Kennedy School also a few years ago after being president of the NAACP. Archon Fung has been on the faculty of the Kennedy School for 20 years and leads our programs in democratic governance, including playing a central role in the Harvard Votes Challenge. David Gergen has also been at our faculty for about 20 years, following years of service in the White House for 4 presidents of both parties. And Nancy Gibbs, who will moderate today, is a visiting professor of practice and was previously the editor-in-chief of Time magazine. Last but not least, of course, Pippa Norris has been on our faculty for many years. She's done a raft of influential research comparing the political developments in different countries, with a focus of late on populism and electoral integrity. Please join me in welcoming these 6 faculty members, and I will turn the microphone over now to Nancy Gibbs to moderate. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. I think of all the different reactions you mentioned, the one that we probably all share in common is exhaustion. We're likely operating on minimal sleep. And so let us remember the watchword of the day, which is patience. We've just seen the latest reminder that democracy rests in the hands of a diverse and restless people, and we should never be surprised by being surprised. One of my journalistic heroes, Molly Ivins, said that the thing about democracy is that it is not neat, orderly, or quiet. It requires a certain relish for confusion. So much as I relish confusion, I'm grateful to be with all of you to try to relieve a bit of it. For all that remains uncertain, I wonder if each of you could just give me an idea of your principal takeaways from what we have watched. And I'm going to go in the order that you are on my screen and ask David Gergen to start us off.
Thank you, Nancy. Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here and join such an august group. Look, I do think that we can find in this recent election, even as the votes are still being counted, a number of reasons for hope. And that is that we had this avalanche of voters who came out this time. We haven't seen this kind of turnout. You know, some people say it goes all the way back to the 1900s. And among the people who turned out so heavily were young people, the next generation, and that should make us pleased as well. There were lots and lots of more people of color. There were far more women. You know, these are the groups that are growing, not only in numbers but in influence, properly so. And it's really good to see them take part and help shape the voices and all that goes with it. I think we can be thankful as well that instead of the mayhem that was predicted by some coming out of the immediate election, our streets are peaceful. Their work is going on and counting ballots all across the United States and a number of states, at least across the country. And it's a very transparent process. People are allowed in not only with cameras, but lawyers are allowed in. It's being carefully watched. It's all being done very professionally as far as anyone can tell. There's a good reason to be hopeful about that. And I think that there is a general sense now in the country that we're going to have a peaceful transition, peaceful transfer of power, something that has characterized America for 200 years. And it's been one of our strongest traditions. We have robust debates. We like to throw verbal jabs at each other, but at the end of the day, historically, we've had a peaceful transfer of power. All those things are very much, I think, to be appreciated and to be saluted today. Having said that, yesterday's and the continuing counting of votes has been it's been a roller coaster ride for many in this country on both sides of the aisle. Frankly, there was a very strong feeling on the Democratic side that Joe Biden went into the election with a very substantial lead. Over the last few weeks, he's been like 8 or 10 points ahead in almost every national poll. There seemed to be a sense that he was the favorite and Donald Trump would be lucky to catch up with him. And the strength of the Trump forces, I think, has surprised everyone. It certainly surprised the pollsters, and I think they've had 2 elections in a row in which Trump has been one of the 2 candidates, and they missed both of them. And in both cases underrepresented the strength of the Trump forces. And I think that's something that the rest of us who are not part of the Trump forces are having to wrestle with and trying to understand. And I think another big question coming out of this, there are a couple of ways still that Joe Biden can become the next president. It did not seem so 24 hours ago or 12 hours ago even. Only this morning did things start shifting as more votes were counted. And now there are 2 really pretty substantial pathways to the White House. We'll have to wait to see. It'll be a close call. You need 270 votes to win the presidency. There is a very reasonable chance that the winner will get just 270 and the loser will get 269. That's how close it has been. And I must say that I think that for a number of my friends on the Democratic side, especially on the left, this has been a depressing experience. It's been a frightening experience because there are many people, I think, on both sides or on all sides who don't really understand each other very well. We see the world through different prisms. We just have a different sense of reality, and we're fearful of people we don't know and their perspective. So coming out of this, even though he has won, I do think it's going to be very difficult for Joe Biden to govern and get some big things done. He did not get the Senate pickups that he was looking for. He will hold the House, assuming he's the president. It's going to take very artful work and a lot of effort by all parties to bring peace among the parties. Now, if it's Donald Trump who wins, and it's still a real chance he's going to wind up winning this thing, I think he's going to have an equally difficult time governing. If anything, the resistance to him is so strong on the left, it may be even more difficult for Trump to govern than it would be for Biden. But let me just leave it there, Nancy. There's a lot more to be said, but we have great people to say things.
Thank you, David. Pippa.
Thank you. And I'd like to reinforce many of the points that David has made. It's a pleasure to be on the panel. I'd like to make 3 points in particular, and indeed quote Dickens to say this in some ways is the best of times and the worst of times. So the risks are about tribal populism, about a legitimacy crisis, but the positives, the silver lining, are levels of engagement and the potential opportunities for reform. So let me just unpack those a little bit. The first point is about tribal populism, and in particular the us, them. Populism in general, we know from many other countries, not just America, divides people. So it's very difficult to get to bargaining and compromise because it's not seen as something which you can just cut the cake in different ways. It's about a vision of the world. For example, about issues like abortion, where there's very little opportunities for compromise. And then you have in America as well, the winner-take-all system and the presidency. And again, that reinforces the lack of compromise, which you don't get in other countries where you have proportional representation. So when we look at the election, I think we can say that there's a remarkably little change throughout the campaign. or in the states that seem to be called, or in the exit poll, the groups that were there in 2016, the states that were there in 2016 are very much what we see today. And what we're really seeing, therefore, is negative partisanship, which again reinforces us them. We're seeing misinformation and motivated reasoning. You get reasons to basically justify your party support or your candidate support. You don't try and listen to the issues. A simple thing from the exit poll, for example, if you thought the president was important to unite the country, you voted for Biden. If you thought it was important to have a strong leader, you voted for Trump. If you thought that COVID was important, you voted for Biden. If you thought that rebuilding the economy was important, you voted for Trump. So we've got two different visions. And it's very difficult for anybody to bridge those, any leader to bridge those, or any organization, or any way to move forward. Second risks, which reinforce that tribal populism, are the legitimacy crisis when soft democratic norms are under threat. And this is a longer term process. And it's clearly there primarily within the Republican Party and the rhetoric of the president, as we saw last night at 2 in the morning, when he said he claimed victory, despite the counting still going on, when he challenges the legitimacy of postal ballots, which of course is nothing new, it's throughout his recent period, and where he sows mistrust in the honesty of elections or the integrity of the process, or indeed how far we can trust the other side. And so that is a great risk, and it's emphasized very much in many countries which are going through backsliding, that where it's not so much the institutions, but where you can't have tolerance and trust on all the different parties, that's when you heighten the tensions. And you could argue that it's essentially the shrinking demographic base of the Republicans, so that the leadership has increasingly, even before Trump, threatened democratic norms. The idea that if you lose, okay, then you concede. That's a basic norm, which is not in the Constitution, but is fundamental to any democratic system. It's authoritarian regimes or regimes which are backsliding where the leader casts doubt on that. But is there a positive lining? I wanted to emphasize it's not all the worst of times, and to emphasize there's promises as well as perils. So the last point is, this is a crisis in many ways, but we can see the good points. As David mentioned, we estimate turnout went up by about 7% to about 67%, which is very high by American standards. Not as high as it could be, but still very high. And engagement, think about the interest people have had. And we know that there still is a path to victory for the Democrats, particularly for Biden in the Electoral College. And it's likely that he also won the popular vote, although again, that depends on counting. And the real point about the silver lining is that a crisis generates opportunities for reform. Very much the Kennedy School's mandate when we think what can be done, how can we improve the process? How can we improve the structure? And there is a number of different ways. For example, convenience voting. More people are used now to voting from home, and that's going to be a demand, and many states have expanded that, even before the COVID crisis. We see better security. More people are concerned about hacking. That's great. And the pressures to implement the For the People's Act of 2019, for example, strengthening campaign finance reform, changing to have more uniform hours of polling, an election day holiday, having judicial reform, having Voting Rights Act re-implemented. All of those are possibles. So the message is clearly patience. There are risks, but there are opportunities. And we're in the middle of all of this. It's a long process. We're all tired, but hopefully some of the positives may still work through, depending on the outcome that we're going to know in the next days or weeks ahead. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Pippa. Cornell Brooks.
Well, first of all, let me just say good afternoon to everyone, and to express my appreciation to the moderator, my panelists, and the dean, and particularly all of you for making time to have this incredible conversation after a sleep-deprived night. So with that said, I want to just lift up 4 C's, if you will, just mnemonically speaking. That being courage, the coronavirus, character, and lastly, college, as in the Electoral College. So when we think about the fact that literally at this moment, the Kennedy School, the country, literally stands on these, amidst these class fissures and racial fault lines in the middle of a pandemic. And nevertheless, nearly 100 million people cast ballots in the midst of 9 million coronavirus cases, 230,000 coronavirus fatalities, nevertheless, people showed up. That speaks to the first point here, that being incredible courage. In other words, where you had people voting, yes, but voting after demonstrating and protesting, a minimum of 27 million Americans in the George Floyd protest. This is a testament to the intestinal fortitude of people all across the country. It speaks volumes about the people you endeavor to serve once you leave the Kennedy School. So that's critically important. Related to that is an unnamed candidate, if you will, on the ballot. That is the coronavirus. The fact that people are casting ballots, literally wearing masks, and the fact that the coronavirus has something to do with which candidate is ahead at what point on the clock. That is to say, those who showed up on election day, who turned out, who tended to believe that the coronavirus was less of a threat in many instances, Republicans, Democrats who, having cast their ballots early, more concerned about the coronavirus, and certainly more inclined to wear masks in many instances, not all, that this is very much a factor in this election. Related to that, in terms of the coronavirus and certainly courage, is literally character in this moment. Listen to the tone and the tenor of our secretaries of state and governors in this moment, speaking to the integrity of these elections, legitimacy of these elections, the carefulness with which people are, and the tension with which people are approaching, monitoring and ensuring the well-functioning of the mechanics of this democracy. This stands in stark contrast to some of the toxic rhetoric we've heard elsewhere in terms of the delegitimization of American elections from abroad and at home. That is something to value. That is something to lift up. That is something to take note of. And when we think about character, consider this. My colleague Pippa lifted up the fact that we may hit 67% turnout, right? In the middle of a pandemic, literally setting a record turnout going back to 1908, 10 years before the last pandemic. This is incredibly important. This speaks to the character of the country, but it also suggests possibilities, new possibilities. And that relates to college as in the electoral college, which is to say, where we have this anachronistic institution that literally, in many ways, is a voter dilution, voter suppression, archaic, primitive institution which stands in the way of the popular vote. So we, particularly in the wake of this election, where if President Trump is reelected, we'll have another instance of a president being elected in contrast to the popular vote. Now, that would be a concern whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. The fact of the matter is the will of the people, it has not yet reached the White House or does not reach the White House consistently. That should be troubling for folks at the Kennedy School. And so the point being here is that in this moment where we've seen record turnout among young people, where we are waiting to count the votes from the most diverse corners of our democracy, namely our cities in places like Atlanta and places like Milwaukee, in those most diverse corners, those are the very corners of democracy that we're waiting to hear from to ensure that perhaps the candidate with the most votes actually wins. This represents, I believe, a tragic opportunity in the wake of this election to think about universal voting, to think about restoring the Voting Rights Act, literally getting rid of the Electoral College and moving on to something else, making voting easier. And thinking about this, think about the African-American woman who at 104 years old, wearing a trench coat, fashionably attired, wearing a mask, but casting her ballot. Think about the 18-year-olds who are casting their ballot for the first time wearing a mask, having come from a protest or demonstration. Think about that Black woman who is 90 years old, who made a 600-mile round trip to ensure that she can cast her ballot. When you think about their courage, their character, you think about the Electoral College, that says to us that this is a leadership moment, and it's a leadership moment for not only the voters, not only elected officials, but it's a leadership moment for the students, faculty, and administrators at the Kennedy School, because if we're going to have anything different, we're the ones with so many others who are going to have to do it.
Thank you, Cornell. Arthur Brooks.
Thank you, Nancy, and thanks to my fellow panelists. And those really eloquent words, Cornell. I attach myself to all of them, and I appreciate them very much. Thinking about what I can do a little bit differently on this panel, I'm not a political analyst. I study human happiness, and I want to talk a little bit about what each of us can do in the current circumstances where we don't know whether or not we're happy or sad. but we can prepare ourselves in either instance to lift ourselves up and to lift other people up. Pippa quite appropriately started with the very beginning of Great Expectations, that it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. The day after an election in the United States, a presidential election in particular, is always that weird combination of the best of times and worst of times. And the reason is it's the best of times that when we have a peaceful election where people choose their leaders, this ahistoric ongoing experiment in democracy is something that I know we're all grateful for. I know that we all celebrate, but it's the worst of times because in point of fact, especially when things are bitterly contested like they are today, millions and millions of people are not just disappointed, they're afraid in many cases, they're bitter, they're angry in a lot of cases. And that really is the worst of times for a lot of people. There is a really important piece of research by one of our colleagues, Todd Rogers, who, if you don't read Todd Rogers' research, you must, because you learn something in everything he writes. And Todd has a paper from 2015 looking back at presidential elections to ask how it affected people and their well-being. and what Todd found is that there's this really weirdly paradoxical effect, which is that the losers lose more than the winners win. In other words, if you're on the wrong side, if your guy lost, and we don't know yet, so I'm preparing you, and there's diversity in the people who are watching, that the people who are bitterly disappointed and unhappy by this are going to be unhappier than the happy people are happy. And this is one of the weird well-being side effects of living in the blessing of democracy, that they have these net unhappiness gains when we go through this particular experiment. But that doesn't mean that we are helpless. There's a lot that we can do. I'm part of the Center for Public Leadership, and I'm blessed to be at the Kennedy School to teach leadership. And so I want to talk a little bit about how each one of us can be empowered in the current circumstances to make things better for ourselves and others. I teach a class at HBS called Leadership and Happiness. And I believe that each one of us should and can and is empowered to lift other people up in their well-being. And this is an example of what we can do if we think about it now and prepare ourselves for when we have a result. Whether we're disappointed or whether we're jubilant, let's be ready. So that's the thrust of what I want to talk about. And I want to talk about very quickly, within my allotted time, 5 things to do and not do as we get ready for this. I know we're on pins and needles and we're, refreshing the New York Times website compulsively, but let's plan our attack as people about this. To begin with, one of the things that tends to happen after bitterly contested elections, especially when we're disappointed, is this tendency for us to lose our sense of agency. We ruminate is what it's called. We think about what could have happened differently. And this puts us into a spiral of negativity and inability to function in day-to-day and the things that we should be spending our time on. Rumination is an inherently negative thing to do. Don't do that. But that leads to the second thing, which is what we can do. After the 2016 election, I was in my hometown, which is Seattle, Washington, and I was talking to a member of my family who was particularly distraught about the outcome of the 2016 election. And I asked him, I said, who won the school board race? And he didn't know. That's a problem. And this is a growing problem in the United States, where the political entertainment industrial complex is feeding us national politics like a reality show, national politics is important, but it's much further away from us than the things that we can really control, the things where we really do have agency. And in fact, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of very good social science research that shows that when we take agency in the things that are local to us, instead of ruminating on what could have happened in things that are not close to us, that can raise our well-being, we can change the circumstances, we can be the agents of the change that we want to see, and we can lift other people up. So the first don't is ruminate. This first do is take agency for things that are local to us and pay attention to those things. The next don't is personalization. There's a tendency to say that when things don't go your way, whether it's one or the other, if you're bitterly disappointed about that, there's a kind of a tendency for us to think that the gods have, are against us in some way. And to personalize these losses, it's worth remembering that, we don't want these outcomes perhaps, but you didn't lose. Particularly if you're a student, you're at the beginning of an important career to lift people up, to become a leader. You have not been repudiated. On the contrary, your ideas are just beginning, and they're just beginning to be able to be nested in the hearts of other people. This is not a personalized loss for you. It's a call to action. It's also not an opportunity to catastrophize. Punditry is a national industry in this country. And what do pundits do? They make sweeping statements because they have to look interesting. And one of the interesting things I'll always say is that this election changes everything. This is it for a whole generation. The whole party is different. It's been changed forever. You know how many times I've heard that? You know how many times I've heard that nothing will ever be the same again? And 2 years later, it's the way it was, or it's completely different than what people had predicted. To catastrophize about one loss, if you are on the disappointed, unhappy side when this thing is all said and done later today or tomorrow or later this week, or I hope soon, it's not a catastrophe because we don't have memory. We're fickle. As a country, we will choose the other side. It's a couple of years old. Your victory, my friends, is coming. And if you're happy, your defeat is coming. No hubris and no catastrophization, because democracy allows us to change things. And that's why we're part of the Harvard Kennedy School community to change things. My last point is an injunction to all of us that if things go the way we want it to go, if things go the way you want it to go, be generous, be magnanimous. This is your opportunity. The data show very clearly that more than 90%, the last data I saw, that 93% of Americans hate how divided we become as a country. I dearly hope that the 506 people who are on this call right now all belong in that 93% who hate how divided this country has become. There's another 7%, however, and those are the people who don't hate how divided this country has become, and that's because they're profiting from it. They're profiting politically and in money and in power and in fame and in followers and popularity. And that's not a good thing for a democracy. The rest of us who are blessed to be in leadership positions, either leadership and training or those of us who are endowed with some amount of authority today, we can help to lead the 93% to represent what's good and true in others. And the way to do it is in victory, to be magnanimous. Aristotle called magnanimity greatness of soul. There is nothing that brings people together more than showing mercy and magnanimity when somebody has experienced a loss. If you're on the wrong side of this, you've experienced a loss. I get it. If you're on the right side of it, this is your opportunity to help create the country that you really want it to be, the country that you really want to love, and the country that it truly can be. It's in our hands. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arthur. And Archon.
Hey, thanks so much, Nancy, and thanks, Doug, and thanks everyone for joining this discussion today. I just want to make a few comments about where we are today and then what that says about a little bit of the bigger picture. And I want to echo what a bunch of people have already said. Engagement is really a high point of what happened yesterday and in the weeks before it. Mike McDonald estimates that 160 million people voted, and that's going to be the highest turnout in 120 years, which is remarkable. And as Pippa suggested, still it's high for us, but a little bit pathetic by international standards. So we should keep that in mind. a couple other things. One is surprise, and David Gergen, some other folks have pointed out that this was a little bit of a surprise, especially for people in blue precincts. And I want to go one step deeper and probe why it was a surprise. And I think it was a surprise because some people in blue precincts were holding in their heads the idea that these big things that have happened, like the pandemic, like the racial reckoning, would have awoken enough people to come to their senses and reject Trumpism, and we'd return to some sort of normal. As of today, I kind of reject that hypothesis. I was kind of divided on it yesterday, but one day makes a lot of difference. And so the surprise is that a lot of America is not the America that at least those blue people thought it was, right? The third thing for today is fear. Many people that I've talked to at the Kennedy School are feeling a sense of fear and anxiety. In the CNN exit polls from last night, 89% of Trump voters report feeling scared about the prospect of a Biden presidency, and 96% of Biden voters report feeling scared at the prospect of a second Trump term. So people are really, really scared. Some people in the chat today are maybe well among them. And if you are, you're in good company. You're in company with the vast majority of Americans, the vast, vast majority of Americans. Those are comments about today. What does this say about the bigger picture? I guess I want to add a little bit. I don't think that I do think that times are changing. I don't think that this is like hotly contested elections of, at least in my memory. And what these past few years have reminded me of this thought that Adam Przeworski had, that democracy is a miracle. It really is a miracle. And why is it a miracle? It's a miracle because in a democracy, people have really, really different views about who God is, or even if there is a God, about how to handle big, big issues like climate change or a global pandemic. And they really, really disagree. And the miracle of democracy is when somebody gets more votes than you, you concede. And why would you concede to someone else who obviously has untrue and unjust views, and you're sure of that? That for somebody to do that is a miracle. And why they do that? It must be because they think democracy is more important than getting their way, right? And that is miraculous, especially when people feel really, really strongly and really, really differently. And what's different today, I think, than in decades past, is that people are feeling more differently, and there's more disagreement. So imagine that you had proposed in the Obama administration something like a universal basic income or a wealth tax or even single payer healthcare. My guess is you would have been politely escorted out of the room with a little bit of a snicker. And similarly, if you propose tearing up global trade agreements and building a wall on the southern border in any of the Bush administrations, you would have been similarly escorted out of the room with a chuckle very quickly. There are just more views and ideas, a wider range on the table now than there have been in a very long time. Margaret Thatcher, somebody reports Margaret Thatcher at a dinner party in 2000, and somebody asked her, "What is your greatest accomplishment?" And she said, "Tony Blair is my greatest accomplishment, because we convinced the other side. There's very little difference between us and them." And I think Ronald Reagan could have said something similar about Bill Clinton. And so those decades were ones in which there were serious disagreements, but they were just in a much more narrow range. And in this huge range of disagreement now, it's very, very hard to keep these institutions together. The picture that I have in my head is American democracy is like a pressure cooker. And if the stuff that's simmering in that pressure cooker is kind of like the difference between Bush and Gore in 2000, you're good because the pressure is pretty low. But if it's the difference between Biden and Trump, the pressure is really, really high. And that pressure cooker runs the danger of cracking and exploding open. And that's where we are right now. And so what do? I think I second, third, what Arthur and Cornell and others have said about stepping up to the plate in democratic leadership. But I think it requires a new set of skills. I think our muscles for dealing with wide range of disagreement are really, really weak because we haven't had to exercise them in a long, long time as students and as educators and as policy professionals, especially as citizens in a democracy. We need to build these muscles to deal with high levels of disagreement. It's really hard to do. I think there are civic muscles. E.E. Schatzsnyder, a political scientist, said democracy is a system of government for people who aren't too sure of themselves, because you're open to persuasion. And civic muscles involve persuading other people and being open to persuasion yourself. And we can talk about how to get there. It takes political muscles, and political muscles here are really fighting for what you believe in a hard, I don't want to say uncompromising, but highly principled way, while at the same time appreciating the value of inclusion. So I'm thinking here of Nelson Mandela when he was inaugurated as president of South Africa after the revolution. He insisted on one guest at his inaugural dinner party, and that was his prison guard at Robben Island, right? And he did that for the purposes of inclusion because he thought that keeping South African society together inclusively was the important thing to do, above insisting on dominating the other side. And then finally, good institutions. And Cornell covered a lot of this ground, and people can talk about this if they're interested in the chat. One, I think there ought to be a right to vote. As Cornell knows, there is no federal right to vote constitutionally. There just isn't. I think there should be, and this election shows why. A second principle is I think voters should pick the politicians and not the other way around. And our institutions have all sorts of examples in which that isn't true, primary among which is gerrymandering. In Wisconsin, in 2018, Republicans got 46% of the popular vote, but they got 63% of the state assembly seats. That's a product of politicians picking the voters. And then I have some other things to say about political reforms and small d democratic reforms like independent redistricting and ranked choice, but let me leave it at that. I think in this highly divided, wide pluralist kind of moment, I think all of us need to develop these muscles to fight for our vision of justice at the same time that we have to insist that that vision include all of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Archon, and thank you all of you for giving us so much to think about. I'm going to ask a few questions and then I'm going to throw this open to you who are listening. But I want to start by picking up on something Pippa talked about, norms. And Cornell, I think I'll address this to you with your mixed background as both clergy and lawyer. And it feels that's where norms lives, not laws, not commandments. So once they are broken, what does it take to revive or replace them? What does that look like, regardless of who ends up winning?
So that's a powerful question and a powerful point made by Pippa. Namely, there have been so many norms that have been transgressed, right? So in terms of the categorical delegitimization of our elections, the premature announcement of victory, right? Whether or not it was in fact accurate. The whole-scale demonization of groups from the White House. Again, this is not a Republican critique, it's a norm observation. That being said, I think Archon lifted up an example of the way in which you counter that, which is to say you need exemplary behavior as a critique of bad behavior. And when we think about the eloquence of example of Mandela, right, in terms of trying to pull together South Africa, taking tremendous substantive action, but also using the power of symbolism. So in the wake of this election, we have to look for strategic opportunities to use symbols to signal norms. But going to the points that Archon lifted up, we also have to look at our institutions. And what I mean by that is we've asked so much from our voters and asked so little from those for whom they have voted. And what I mean by that is our institutions are out of sync with the character. Think about it. We have literally asked people to risk their lives, right? They've demonstrated courage over and over and over again. And so in terms of doing a normative reset in this country, symbolic reform, and if you will, symbolic action, institutional reform, but also focusing on the mechanics of leadership. And that's what the Kennedy School does. Because I can tell you, having led, a large civil rights organization, having filed many voter suppression lawsuits, both from the vantage point of the NAACP, being a Justice Department alum, it's the mechanics of democracy that we have to focus on. And unfortunately, and this is a point that Archon has lifted up, many of the hundreds of lawsuits have been filed in this election have been filed to keep the people's votes from being counted. We need lawsuits to ensure that they will be counted.
So Pippa, at the other end from where Cornell is, the other end of respecting norms is a willingness to just ignore even things that are laws. And I was struck by a survey Foreign Policy did in July that found that 31% of Americans think it's a good idea to have a strong incumbent leader who does not have to bother with Congress and elections.
That's right. And it's even higher amongst Republicans, unfortunately.
So I'd love to hear you talk a little about where you feel like this moment of populist power fits in our history and in comparison to other countries that you study.
Yes, and that proportion, by the way, has gone up in America, unfortunately. In 1990, in the World Values Survey, when people were asked about, do you approve of having a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with elections? About a quarter of the Americans agreed with that. Now it's 37% in the most recent survey. And to come to your question, really, the issue is that soft norms, we've taken them for granted. We've been kind of asleep at the wheel in America. We haven't really looked at some of the things, such as executive power and the reliance on executive orders in order to get things done under both Obama and under Trump. The role of the courts and the way that they've taken over so many of the key decisions rather than the role of elected bodies. So I think what America needs to do is think about the formal institutions, the institutions that many other new democracies have really adopted. Things like independent election commissions, of course. If you're starting with a new election and you don't have a constitution on the books, you think about that as one of the first priorities. And there are so many other innovations which have been done in other countries about electoral reforms, about finance, about issues of how people can vote, and about the basic structures. So our institutions are a bit sclerotic. They're kind of not fit for purpose anymore. And we need to look, I think, at a range of other countries. And there's a couple of ways we might manage to do that in practice. Many places are now taking up citizens' assemblies, for example. It's a way, if the parties are divided about the basic rules of the game, then you think about, can we involve a representative group of citizens across the country to deliberate and think about the opportunities? It's been done, for example, in British Columbia about electoral reform. It's been done in Ireland over abortion. It's being done now in many European countries as well. So a citizen assembly or the classic bipartisan commission to really look at the state of democracy, do a democratic audit, which again, you say, okay, how are we doing? We're strong on this, we're not so good on that. And if you get the right institutions, then you get the right incentives and they shape the informal norms, because then every party, every politician basically can follow those if there's a consensus about them. But right now our norms are fraying, and they have been fraying, I think, for basically at least a decade. Things like, for example, the role of lawyers in elections goes right back to Bush v. Gore 2000. The problems of electoral finance goes back many, many decades. The problems of minority inclusion is nothing new. Voter suppression is nothing new. So all of these are challenges. And again, this passion that's gone into this election and the ways in which people have been shocked, I think, and the ways in which people feel that the system isn't working may produce enough of a momentum for having reform. At present, the Biden campaign had a large program of reform that they thought they might be able to bring forward. That would very much depend on the Senate, whether the Senate would go along with that. But I think the public as well can really engage in this process, and the Kennedy School can, to say, what are the institutional choices? Let's learn from Canada. Let's learn from Australia. Let's learn from Britain, which had a major program of reform in the 1970 period, and say, what can we do better? And then the informal social norms, you won't rely on them so much if the rules of the game are actually fairer.
Thank you, Pippa. Obviously, we've talked a lot about institutions, but Arthur, I want to come back to individuals and pick up on something you said about both the outrage industrial complex and the overwhelming desire that surveys show about people's desire to be united. And I'm wondering how you square that with the notion that partisan identity has become the church that people belong to. And the whole idea that we, Liliana Mason's phrase that we're ideologues without issues. To the extent that partisan identity has become such an overwhelming part of people's identity, how then do we get past that to even go anywhere near the kinds of institutional reforms that would be necessary to move forward?
I think that a large part of what we're seeing today, and again, this is part and parcel with populism. Populism suggests to us that our identity is paramount in the political process and that we need somebody who's going to protect that identity politically. And populists have always done this, but populism is a very interesting phenomenon. And again, I'm not trying to play a political scientist because we have more competent political scientists on the panel. But I will be an economist here, which is what I suffered through in my PhD. And one of the things that we find is that in the decade and a half to 2 decades after a financial crisis, populism always rises. We have data on 800 elections over 120 years in 20 developed economies. And from those data, we find that in the 15 to 20 years after a financial crisis, the one thing that always happens is that there's an asymmetry and unevenness in economic growth, and that leads to a political populism. In specifically, a financial crisis 10 years later has a 30% causal increase in the voter share for populist parties and candidates. This is what we're seeing by the numbers. And the number one technique that populist candidates use is to say, this is your identity and I will fight for you.
Right.
This is what Daniel Goleman, our colleague here at Harvard, calls coercive leadership. It's bullying behavior, and is basically when you get into this polarity, this political polarity of fear, which is the opposite polarity of love, because love and fear are opposite psychologically, philosophically, theologically. And when you're in a polarity of fear, which goes along with populism, which goes along with what has actually happened from an uneven distribution of resources and opportunities, then you're going to get into this paradigm. Then you're going to get into people basically saying, and it's not an identity problem. It's basically saying, I may not like that person and respect that person, but I sure prefer my bully. I sure prefer my bully because I'm afraid of the other one. And that speaks to what David Gergen was talking about. Look, everybody's afraid right now. What are they afraid of? They're afraid of the fear polarity in American politics, which has spawned the competing populisms. They may not be symmetric, and people are absolutely legitimate in saying there's more on one side than the other, but there's plenty to go around, not just at the presidential level, but all down, cascading down the parties. And that's leading people to choose their own bully and to say that this is my identity, and to see anything against that as an ego threat, which will destroy relationships. One quick stat: 1 in 6 Americans has stopped talking to a friend or family member since the 2016 election, and it's gotten worse. That's a tragedy. It's a travesty, actually. And that comes because populism, because of ego threat, because of identity, and because of fear-based bullying. And I think our opportunity in this community, this wonderful community, is to start to trying to turn the polarity toward love.
Well, this is going to be a hard transition to go straight from love to money, but I want to have a chance to ask David Gergen about a couple of the things that I think were most surprising in the results, even as we know them now, which the astonishing amount of money, $90 million in the Mitch McConnell campaign, $108 million to try to defeat Lindsey Graham, astonishing amounts of money spent that appear not to have had much effect. And so there's been so much discussion about how the corruption of our politics and the problems of our politics has to do with dark money and the flow of money. And I'm wondering how you come away thinking, having watched the role that money played and did not play, about how we should be thinking about that today.
I think it's less central to the range of concerns we ought to have today than it has been in the past. I think you're right that an awful lot of money was poured into this campaign in variety of races. South Carolina, on both sides of that Senate race there, they spent a ton of money. and it didn't seem to have much influence. It didn't, I think Lindsey Graham came away with sort of the victory you would have expected, and that it helped Harrison for a while, but not very long. So I may be wrong about this, but in times past, there were various individuals that who would bankroll very privately a candidate in primaries. Newt Gingrich got a lot of dark money like that, and it actually made a real difference, I think, in our policies. But I just think it's less influential now than it was. That Donald Trump has shown, among other things, that he could command a national stage and have a huge influence on the national conversation without spending a hell of a lot of money. The opposition got all the money. He didn't spend a lot of money. So it's just right at the moment, it may come back. We're going to find some industry or something, or we're going to say fracking or, various fossil fuel industry folks are going to have a lot of influence the next 15 years. And that's going to be, I think we can worry about that then. I think we have bigger problems of the kind that have been brought up here. And also, what are we going to do about the healthcare system when the Supreme Court knocks it down? What are we going to do when the climate now, we're not only going to not return to the Paris Peace Accords, it looks like, in a serious way, but there's going to be a Senate that's not going to go along with a lot of things that Biden may propose. How do we even get the pandemic addressed in the transition with Nancy Pelosi and the Trump and affordable and Mitch McConnell and now Biden all disagreeing with each other about how to get this done? I think there's a heavy responsibility on whoever wins this, whether it's Biden or Trump, to figure out how to have a fresh start in our politics. We desperately need that.
In that vein, Archon, this was of the many framings of this race, that one obvious one, that this was a referendum on both Trump and Trumpism. And where we are at 1:58 in the afternoon, certainly we don't know yet to the extent to which the fate for President Trump, but Trumpism appears to be alive and well and maybe have a depth and power that was widely underestimated. There was a headline in the Washington Post this morning, win or lose, Trump has once again left the elites flabbergasted. And so I'm wondering, since we are a panel of Harvard professors and sometimes journalists, which is if 3 strikes and you're out, if you can talk a little bit about where you see the future of Trumpism and maybe the lack of understanding of it and what it's going to take to address that.
Yeah, I think I'll answer that obliquely. One, I think it does leave the elites flabbergasted. If you look at the CNN exits, people with an advanced degree, obviously kind of tilt very, very heavily toward Biden votes. That's one of the most significant variables that you can find. I just wanted to depart from David just for a moment. I think money still really is quite important, and I would direct people's attention to Prop 22 in California, which was the ballot referendum item to get rid of the rule that classified Uber and Lyft drivers as employees. Uber and Lyft plowed $200 million into that campaign, and the other side, a couple of labor unions, got up to, I think, maybe $15 million. So they were outspent more than 10 to 1, and the big spending money won, right? And it's a kind of pretty important feature of labor law in the United States. And I think it makes a big difference. On the Trumpism, I think it's pretty complicated. I think that there's a tendency in these conversations to think that voters are this or that thing. As a political scientist, I think that voter behavior is determined a lot by what the parties are doing and the political institutions. And so a lot of the Obama-Trump switchers were people who register as having a high level of racial antipathy on some of these surveys, but they voted for the first Black president, right? So, voters can be lots of different things. I guess at some level, I think that American politics is really changing, and the two-party system is just not up to dealing with the range of views out there, and insisting on 2 parties gets people, exacerbates this polarization. And I recommend Lee Drutman's book, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, which is really good on this. There's a lot of different ways to think about it, but fancifully, you might think, well, there are kind of three big political views out there. There's kind of decency, which is the Lincoln Project and Ross Douthat and David Brooks to the Joe Biden of 2000 or 2006. We'll call that decency or establishment. There's social democracy or justice, which is Bernie and AOC and maybe Liz Warren. That's probably, maybe 20 or 30% of the population. And there's freedom, which is Donald Trump, maybe Josh Hawley, maybe Tom Cotton, another 20 or 30%. And if our political system could accommodate more than two views or two big sets of views, you'd get a very different set of things playing out. And freedom and justice would be doing some deals with each other, as would freedom and decency and justice and decency. But our system, unlike most advanced democracies in the world, does not accommodate more than two views right now.
Thank you for that. I want to throw this open to questions. And so the first question comes from Gregory Walsh.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I'm a fellow at the Kennedy School. I've been trying to reconcile the discrepancy between polling and voter turnout. And I was wondering if somebody might, help me with this question. It seems to me that there is a degree of people who are either not being polled or are failing to answer pollers. At least that's my assumption with the polling. I also, in some of my social media studies and things like this, have noticed this tendency for one side to label a political group as racist or bigot, and the other side to label a political group as socialist or communist. So I'm wondering, to what degree do you think, this type of polarization is quashing the marketplace of ideas, both in academia and everyday life? And if my assumptions are correct, what do we do about it? One, as a community, and then two, as an individual. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregory. Who'd like to take that?
Just a quick point on the turnout and polling. One of the issues is that if you look in the exit poll, you'll find that those who decided late voted for Trump disproportionately. Those who decided early voted for Biden. So part of the reason why we got this impression was that we were looking at the polls in September and October, and that was perhaps when Biden did have a more genuine lead. But in the last week, and it's only a small group, but those who switched, basically, if you look in the last week, 63% said they voted for Trump, 30% voted for Biden. So there was something in those last few days that we haven't really properly analysed that we need to take into account. That could be why we got one impression from the polls throughout the campaign, and then another one actually on polling day.
David, do you have a theory about the polling that after all of the promises among pollsters about going back into the 2016 data, reweighting their samples, all of the corrections that were meant to be made to avoid a repeat of the confusion last time of what happened this time?
I don't have an informed a judgment on it. I do think that they have a hell of a lot to answer for. And missing two elections in a row, two major national elections in a row, they really ought. I mean, the best people in this business are good. The Charlie Cooks of the world are honest folks. They're trying to figure this out. It's not that they're trying to skew the polls or that they're favoring one side or the other. They get hurt. They get bad when they reputationally get hurt, and their livelihood is imperiled when they screw these things up too badly. So I don't know what they missed. I can't figure it out. It's when you really get into polling, it gets more arcane very quickly, and you realize there's also some guesswork about who's coming out and who's not coming out. But it is. I think what you're going to find in the next 2 weeks or so is that they're going to be called to account, and you're going to start to see a national conversation about it among them, and then they'll have a couple of national conferences in which they'll try to sort of refigure things out.
I would hope that conversation very much includes the media that relies so heavily on that.
Well, it also goes to the questions how there are a lot of questions the media has to answer about how much time do you give to the pollsters? How much consideration do you give it? How much time do you give to Donald Trump in a second term if he's the president when he wants to make a speech? How much coverage do you give him there? It goes back to Arthur's industrial complex, the outraged industrial complex. I love that term, Arthur. I'd love to hear more about it. Who belongs to that? How many of us here at this panel belong to that?
None of us, David, none of us.
Since we're all spared, tell us what it really means.
Oh, yeah, this is a term of art that, I'm not sure if I introduced it or not in my last book, but the whole idea is that there are people who are profiting from driving Americans apart, as opposed to the vast majority of Americans who want to bring people together. So that, and it's not, and again, this is not unity on the basis of some sort of forced consensus. On the contrary, most really strong communities, they don't require consensus. They don't require agreement at all. I mean, there are many issues where I will never agree with my beloved wife. We go hammer and tongs on certain things that we have for 30 years, and I hope for another 30. But the point is, we coexist because here's my point, David. Sometimes, I was addressing, I was at I keynoted one of the congressional retreats. It was a great honor. And I said, how many of you wish we lived in a one-party state? And 0 hands went up. How many of you are grateful that we live in a two-party, multi-party, but two-party democracy? All the hands went up. I said, you just told me that you're grateful for the other side. Because if you're grateful that there are multiple opinions, you're grateful for people who don't hold your opinion. And if you actually are conscious of that gratitude, you cannot become part of an outraged industrial complex that profits in any way, pecuniary or non-pecuniary, from driving Americans apart and blowing up this sense that our differences are fatal and actually should lead to some permanent rift. So that's my point.
Good, great.
Yeah, Cornell.
Yeah, I just wanted to address the latter part of the question about the political caricature of one party and one group of Americans as being socialist, and another group of Americans in a party being composed of racists. You have this whole matter of political caricature, and I think Arthur certainly alluded to this notion that in this digital democracy, outrage and anger and algorithms are a form of currency, right? So in other words, you get more followers, you attract more attention, you generate more political leverage through outrage and anger. All that being said, there's certain empirical realities. This presidency coincides with certainly in 2018, a 16-year high in violent hate crime. This coincides with what feels to many like a pandemic of police misconduct. It coincides with the polls that show that a tremendous number of Americans don't rank racial justice up there with the economy and the coronavirus, but fairly high up. The point being here is it's not a matter of socialism and bigots on one side or the other, but the reality that the real challenges and disparities with respect to the coronavirus along race and class and ethnic lines, police misconduct and police brutality. You don't see everyday Americans saying that every Republican or Democrat is a socialist or a racist, but you do see people saying, we have real concerns in this society that we need to address. And so the point being here is, I don't want to suggest any false equivalence, that these two things are on the same plane, because there's an underlying and overarching reality that can't be ignored.
Thank you for that, Cornell. Our next up is Evelyn Nam.
Hi, is this working? Okay, cool. Hi, my name is Evelyn. I graduated from HKS this May. I ask this with a great sense of urgency. Regardless of who wins, I think I need to begin working for the future starting today, like immediately, but I have felt a serious lacking in my skill set. And I want to ask for advice from such a well put together panel. I've been with the Biden campaign, particularly Women for Biden team, and I was based in a 50%, 60% Trump county. And I have really come to realize how sheltered I was at HKS, because everyone at HKS intuitively understood what racism is, what systemic racism is, what misogyny is. So they were more or less on the same page as me. But when I got to the Trump County, I realized that I lack the layperson language, skill sets, and strategy to communicate to people why Trumpism is such a problem, and to communicate with them like what actually is racism and why misogyny is everywhere. But now that I'm out of school, I lack classroom access and I feel very stuck. I know I am not alone in this struggle. So I wanted to ask advice from the panel how I can acquire those types of communication strategies and leadership capabilities now that I'm out of school, and the strategies that would work to really convey to people why Trumpism is such a problem. And I ask this out of desperation. So thank you so much for putting together the panel.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think a good, I think probably it's a lot easier to build those skills maybe where you are now than it would have been in an MPP program or something like that, because you have the opportunity to live in communities of people who, most of whom think very, very, very differently from you. And I guess my first piece of advice is don't begin with the idea that you're trying to convince people that they're wrong about their politics. Begin by listening to what their life is like and what their concerns are and what their hopes and dreams are, and why their hopes and dreams are connected to a certain political vision or other, and really try to help them solve the problems that they feel like they have and they're trying to solve. And that's the beginning of solidarity. And the first understanding, I think, is you learning about them. And when you're working with people, of course, they'll learn about you as well, and you'll be able to have a real authentic conversation. But you won't be able to have that conversation if you go in presuming that you have a view of the truth that's very different from theirs and you're going to educate them. I just don't think that works.
So one thing I'd like to lift up just from the vantage point of the Center for Public Leadership. So if we endeavor to teach leadership, and certainly my colleagues and I endeavor to teach advocacy in the context of real communities. So one of the things that we certainly teach in my course and others is how to listen, how to create an architecture of listening. How do you structure your organization so that you hear from people and you're able to articulate their concerns in their language as opposed to trying to convince them of the validity of your language. Two, how do you build coalitions that are iterative and concentric and that bring people in ways that are thoughtful and for the long term? So in other words, it's not merely this election. So when we think about this election, again, not being partisan, but since you're speaking to how do you deal with the whole matter of Trumpism, right? So if this election is a matter of record turnout and where field organizers talk about creating movement energy, how do you create a movement that brings people in as opposed to merely energizing the people you already have? Those are things that we do teach. Those are things that are evident in our case studies when we don't treat our case studies as analytic tinker toys, but morally immersive experiences where we really try to engage how people think, how they feel, how they morally process the issues that concern them. So my point being is there's much here at the Kennedy School that I think can be helpful in exactly the kinds of situations that you're in, where you're in a real community, trying to convince people, trying to engage people, trying to move people in real time. And I would hope that we can create those kinds of experiences for alum to connect with through executive education and other opportunities. Certainly people like Marshall Gantz offer a tremendous amount of coursework and instruction on the digital platform, but there are others as well.
Pippa, did you have something you wanted to add? You're muted.
I think about the issue agenda and where there are commonalities that you can build upon, and particularly what one might term more consensual policies. So if it's concerns about the economy and jobs and your community, if it's concerns about factories leaving your area, or problems about young people who aren't able to stay where their families are, those are the things that perhaps you can build some community conversation. But I'd avoid those key issues in some ways that were mentioned, which Evelyn mentioned on issues like misogyny and racism, which are identities, as Arthur mentioned. They're so key. Issues about patriotism or believing in a more cosmopolitan values, believing in religion or believing in secularization. These are the cultural cleavages which are really incredibly difficult to breach because they're about our core values and they threaten your social identities. So find those areas of commonality and build on those. And then basically don't avoid, whenever we went canvassing, I always used to say, you know, don't talk about policies on the doorstep. Try and make sure that you've got some areas where they agree with you and know which party you're from. And perhaps that's the best way to proceed.
Wenshi Yu is the next questioner.
Hi. Thank you, everyone. I think this conversation, you know, really brings me some calmness as we are living in this like every 10-second update about the counting of the votes. So really appreciate this big picture conversation. My question is related to the social media and sort of the overwhelming information age we live in. You know, I really think the social media platforms have changed democracy and how civic participation, or what civic participation really means. So how do you think they have influenced democracy and elections from 2016 to, you know, this time, and how will they continue to impact our traditional democracy or Western democracy in the future?
David, you want to take that on?
Yeah, but I'm not the comparative person. Pippa would be far better for comparative purposes. But here, I do think it's obviously had a huge impact on the way we conduct our discourse, and the negativity, the lies, the lack of accountability, and the anonymity, I think have all contributed to making, you know, at the very minimum, a double-edged sword, but I think it's more like a sewage system frequently when you get into it, because you find so many things. I can tune in and on Twitter, which I use, I can tune in and find out things that are happening I might not have known about, and I find that helpful. But I find the degree of dialogue and the sort of the jabbing of each other and the negativity to be very demeaning, and I think contributes to a sort of a rancid discourse. And I don't think we found a way to stop that right now, because the people who are, you know, you have for whom you have the most respect write the most plain vanilla materials and don't get a big audience. You get a big audience when you say outrageous things. And by the way, I don't think that's just related to or connected to social media. I think that goes on in all the media. You know, the people who sort of can say outrageous things tend to have more coverage. But Pippa, really, you're the one who understands this best internationally.
So I wrote The Digital Divide in 2000, and then I said, look, technology is a kind of neutral thing. It can be used for good or ill, obviously. So it can expose us to more information about all sorts of breaking news, or it can reinforce bubbles and mean that we only listen to our own side. And I don't necessarily blame, obviously, the social media. Think about Fox Television versus CNN. We've got the same mirror of some people, 40% or so, tuning in all the time to Fox, and others of our friends tuning into CNN. So it's that division which is then reinforcing the idea of us, them, and populism, which is making it worse. And there've always been divisions in the media. Think back to the yellow press of the 19th century. Think back to the ethnic press of the turn of the century, where people would only tune into one or two sources. But I think that really populism has made it worse, because that challenges facts, it challenges science, it challenges expertise. And that means that there's no neutral way to adjudicate between rival visions of society. And so we blame the media, the social media, too easily, I think, for broader problems in the media in general, communications in general, and then populism. That's also basically at the heart of what we're talking about. And remember, again, the internet came around in 1994 in its modern form, but we're talking about problems now of 2016, 2020. So the timing doesn't quite fit of when these technologies became more widely available through the World Wide Web, and when we're having real divisions in society.
Archon?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and really critical. I think the social media and the news sphere generally, we should treat as important as our political constitution for the health of democracy, right? And so Facebook, Google, the social media platforms, they're interested in making money. They're businesses, and any side effects that they have, any good effects that they have on democracy would be purely coincidental. And so it would be kind of amazing if they had good effects, right? Because they're just not trying to do that. Nancy and David's precursors in mass media after the war, World War II, put a lot of effort into thinking about how to make mass media good for democracy, and they turned that arc. And in this moment, unless we put a similar social effort into thinking about how to make social media good for democracy, as we would designing a constitution, I don't think it's going to go very well.
The last question goes to Jose Martinez.
Hi, yes. Like many of you, I do believe that diversity in political thought is not only important, but pivotal for our democracy. My question is for Professor Arthur Brooks. In the pursuit of political power, do you believe that President Donald Trump will continue to be an asset or a liability for the conservative, for the Republican Party? Really curious about your opinion on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. It's a big question. It's a hard hanging question for the end, because it very much depends on whether or not any one of us believes that Donald Trump ever was an asset to conservatism or to the Republican Party, or to any part of the political. And again, look, we still have 330 people on the call, and there are some on either side of that question. My own particular view is that for the integrity of American political conservative thought, that Donald Trump was not an asset, and agree or disagree whether he was right or wrong, but because he doesn't have even remotely conventional conservative views that would bolster a movement that ties the conservative thinking to the intellectual past and creates an aspirational future that can actually unify and bring people into a broader, bigger coalition. As such, I see Donald Trump as a Republican now, politician now, who came along and basically took that particular title, but didn't base it on anything that came in the past and didn't build anything that's going to be going into the future. As such, whether it's a liability, you'll have to leave up to your own point of view. But as an asset, it's hard to think whether or not, would be hard for me to make a case that, at least in my way of thinking, that he could be considered an asset to that particular ideological strain in American politics. So let me kick that for a better answer to a real political scientist, Archon Fung.
I think I better take a pass on that, Arthur. I'm not versed in the very careful debates within American conservatism, which I think are very important.
I think given what we have been watching, there are going to be really interesting debates going on all ends of the ideological spectrum in both parties. I'm, Doug, very grateful for you for creating the circumstance for us to come together and think hard about hard things and be reminded of how lucky we are to be in a place where we can work on those things and move forward together. So thank you for making this possible, and to everyone who joined us.
Thank you, everybody. It's very grateful, Nancy, to you and to Arthur and Cornell and Archon and Pippa and David. I'm grateful to the hundreds of you who've joined us today. These are important issues that are central to the work of the Kennedy School, that we've been working on, thinking about, teaching about, writing about, communicating about for a long time, and we have a lot more work to do together. So take care of yourselves, please, in these complicated times, and we will keep going with this conversation. Thank you all very much. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.